que han integrado este cuarto foro de la democracia, porque lo hacen de una manera altruista. El trabajo que hacemos en el IFE, la OEA, Colegio de México, Fondo de Cultura Económica, IFES, IDEA, es un trabajo básicamente educativo, de formación cívica. Es una actividad no lucrativa, de tal manera que los señores que están aquí con nosotros nos están apoyando en ese esquema altruista. Y a todos ustedes muchas gracias también por su entusiasmo.
Conditions. Thank you very much. So the moderator for this second keynote conference is Flavia Freidenberg. She is a scholar from Argentina and from Spain, from the University of Salamanca, with whom we have already had several projects on training for civic education. Thank you, and Flavia, the floor is yours. Hi, good morning. Welcome to this fourth forum on democracy that welcomes us to analyze the democracies that we have in Latin America and which are the things on which we need to reflect to improve it. Today, it's an honor and a pleasure to have with us Leonel Fernández Reina, former president of the Dominican Republic on 3 occasions, 3 different administrations, 1996, 2000, 2004, and 2007, and 2008, 2012. Therefore, he is an authority to speak about democracies from his point of view as a political officer, as he's one of the most acknowledged politicians in Latin America, especially because of the changes that happened in the Dominican Republic during his administrations. However, former President Leonel Fernández is also well known for his academic background and actions, and during his administrations he has dedicated most of his efforts in the improvement of the academic situation for the people of the Dominican Republic. So I think this is a great opportunity to hear the academia from the voice of the politician and politics from the voice of the academic. I think it's like talking with Max Weber, the scientist and the politician. We're going to talk about the relationship between poverty and representation crisis, and I think the authority of former President Leonel Fernández will help us to understand what it is, and what's going to happen with regard to the social cohesion in 2020. If we go as far as 2014, we would have done a great job. If we go all the way to 2020, it would be wonderful. Thank you very much, Mr. Leonel Fernández, for being in this fourth forum on democracy, and we are ready to listen to your ideas. Thank you, Flavia, for your kind introduction. And first of all, I want to show my appreciation to the organizing committee of this fourth forum on democracy and for having me invited to participate in this forum. I also want to congratulate Dr. Dante Caputo for his book, Governing the Future, which is the baseline of our discussions in this forum. Once again, taking into account what was said when the book was made published between the relationship between the past and the future, I would like to begin my presentation by remembering that during these last years, especially since 2008, we have been celebrating in Latin America the 200 years of our independence. About this historic time, we look at it as the breaking point with the colonial authority. And after that breaking point, the build-up of the state of the states in Latin America. But we know that right after the proclamation of the independence, what happened in our region was anarchy and political instability, a chronic one. So that somehow gave place to the phenomenon of the leaders, and it was just a search for order. I would say that since the construction of the nation, since the beginning of the Republic, in Latin America we have always pursued a state of law based upon democracy. However, it was not possible during the 19th century and during a lot of years of the 20th century, with rare exceptions. Democracy was the exception in the 19th century and throughout the great part of the 20th century, and it was authoritarianism the one that prevailed. But let's think about it. The relationship between capitalism and democracy is what we had, and I think in the classical theory we have this relationship, understanding democracy as the political expression of capitalism.
Tránsito histórico post-independencia en América Latina es la insuficiencia del desarrollo de una economía capitalista.
Insufficiency of the development. So instead of having industrial bourgeois, we had oligarchies, landowners that were linked to the agrarian sector and to the cattle sector and the mining sector, and they were connected by the exports of some mineral or cattle products. So we were talking about oligarchies that were based upon the primary products. Therefore, I would say that the insufficient development during the 19th and 20th century hindered the democratic institutional development of Latin America. And I believe that, especially in Mexico, we had the Mexican Revolution, and that was 100 years after the independence. And the purpose of the revolution was the establishment of the democratic regime, but at the same time it was a civil riot. We can see it in the proclamation of the 1917 Constitution in the state of Querétaro. Is the very first Latin American constitution that includes a social clause. And by saying all this, what I want to tell you is that Latin America has always had this idea for democracy from the beginning of the independence, but it has been hindered by the lack of development of the economic and social forces in our region. So in order to understand current times, now we have to go and study what happened after the Second World War. On one hand, we are going to see that three things began in favor of democracy at that time. Right after the Second World War, we saw that for the case of Venezuela, for the case of Costa Rica, for the case of Guatemala, we had a democratic thrust that was somehow reverted like it happened in Venezuela. It was just a short movement. In the case of Costa Rica, it ended up being a revolution headed by José Freidenberg, and in Guatemala with the beginning of José Arevalo's democratic government, and then with Jacobo, who was overthrown because of foreign participation. So that was the end of the first thrust for democracy after the Second World War. We found it again at the end of the 50s, especially with what happened in Colombia and Venezuela. the fall of the regime in Colombia and Pérez Jiménez in Venezuela. And that gave place to the democratic access of Rómulo Betancourt and the fixed point pact that maps out the current life, political life in Venezuela. So that was the second thing that happened after the Second World War. However, they were interrupted with several coups d'etat during the 60s in the case of Brazil, in the case of Ramón Villela Morales, in the case of Honduras, and also in Guatemala. A lot of coups d'etat that interrupted the Second World War democratic times. So now we are in our current times. Well, actually, it was at the end of the 70s, beginnings of the 80s, when we had what we called the Latin American democratic transition in what Samuel Conti has called the third democratic wave at a global level. In our case, it's the third current wave after the Second World War. This last democratic transition has allowed us in Latin America to have, for the very first time, after 200 years of history as a republic, to be able to have more than 3 decades of political stability. Never before in the history of Latin America had we ever achieved what we have right now, and interrupted with some of exceptions, but with the principle that legitimacy is how you do the power, how you take people into power, and it is how the guerrillas are now put into the past. Now, in order to establish the connection between democracy, economic and social development, poverty reduction, and social inequality, it is highly important to first understand the circumstances under which this transition took place in the 80s. Of course, it is not a normal model. It's totally different from ordinary. And if we look at it from the point of view of comparisons with other regions, usually the transition is towards a democratic system when we have economic and social development. In the case of Asia, South Korea developed socially and economically, and there comes the time in which there is a claim of human rights and dignity and things like that, and democracy is just the natural result of that economic and social development. It's the case of Taiwan. They began with a sustained economic growth, with sustained levels of prosperity, and that gave place to the democracy. But in Latin America was the other way around. Latin America already had a bad reputation on what was known as the bureaucratic democratic state. The military had already a bad reputation because of their aggressiveness, because of their policies that did not take into account human rights. And on top of all that, they had the lack of capacity to manage, and the economic crisis that was just beginning in the area, or that was being incubated, that was going to begin. So it was a transition that was ordered from the top, like in the case of Brazil, or sidewise, like in the Dominican Republic, or the emergence of new leaders. There were just different ways in which it happened. But the truth is that it was under the circumstances of the crisis of legitimacy, and that is how we changed in Latin America into governments ruled by democracy. Now, Of course that at the beginning all the countries were very happy because finally we had achieved freedom, independence, and now human values and human dignity were going to be acknowledged. But as there was an economic crisis already stated and already established, the crisis just continued throughout the century and we ended up losing time. The decade of the foreign debt and the decade of the incapacity of the governments to face the debt because they were already worn out because of the economic model that they began to work from the end of the Second World War to the beginning of the 70s. So, as a result of this situation, which was actually progress from the point of view of democracy, the electoral democracy that Dante Caputo mentioned, things started to change in the 80s. But with all these problems and lack of capacity to meet the demands of the population. So at the beginning of the 90s, the Washington Consensus, the so-called Washington Consensus, came and tried to change the previous model that was the developing model with a lot of state participation and which actually contributed to the process of industrialization, replacing imports, changing into an economic growth, not a stable one, but there was economic growth. So this model in the 70s began to show fractures, and the most important one was the hyperinflation and the lack of stability in the economic indicators. And that is what was supposed to be corrected with the Washington Consensus or agreement, with the 10 laws of Williamson, as it was known, and which is known as neoliberalism in Latin America. The Washington Agreement, or the neoliberal policy, tried to establish macroeconomic stability, the release of the market, and the release of the the financial sector. However, there was stability, but by the middle of the 90s, with the crisis in Asia and the crisis in Russia, in 1997, from 1997 to 2002, we have what is known as the 5-year period lost. Once again, the economies were not able to reach the economic levels in order to face the problems, to reduce poverty, and therefore generate prosperity and progress. So now we are in our times. What happened between 2003 to 2013, this last decade? This last decade is been known as the golden decade for Latin America and the Caribbean. Never before has ever so much wealth been generated in the region, levels of growth as we have them now, and the reduction in the levels of extreme poverty and social inequality. How did it happen? Yesterday we were saying that it was not due to a dynamic that happened within the region. It was actually a result of the behavior of the global economy, especially the emergence of countries such as India and China, the BRICS, which with these high rates of growth started to demand basic products from the Latin American economies, mainly minerals, agricultural products, and because of all that, local or regional governments like Brazil, Chile, Peru have benefited from this high demand of commodities, especially from China. So, it is important to highlight that, different to the economic models of the past, after 2003, even though there are some previous examples, as the case of Mexico, everybody started to establish social policies. Before that, the only thing that we cared was to have economic growth policies. That's what happened during the Reagan session, the trickle-down economy. If the economy grows, that is going to spread out into other sectors, and everybody is going to benefit from that policy. But the history showed that that was not true. It is not true that by having an adequate economic policy, we will create well-being. So a different stage started with the creation of other type of policies. And in Latin America, during that last decade, social policies were established, such as conditioned transference policies. In the case of Mexico, the Oportunidades program. In our case, the Solidarity card in the Dominican Republic. And each country used different policies to reduce poverty and to create conditions for human development. So with all that, now analysts such as Nora Lustig, with her team of researchers, has said that for the very first time, we are looking at poverty reduction and reduction of social inequality from the point of view of income, access to education, access to health care, and access to retirement plans. So, to say that social inequality is gone, that we don't have a lot to be do with poverty reduction, it's not totally appropriate. However, during this decade, as a result of being part of the global economy, we have managed to somehow reach those goals. However, the most important thing to look into the future is to understand that after 2007, 2008, we had the global recession phenomenon on which we are right now still. And taking into account this concept of global recession, now we have a reduction of economic growth of the countries that had been generating the demand of commodities from the Latin American economies. The case of China, for example. China was growing with a 12% annual rate. And in the last 2 years, they are now undergoing a deceleration process. And for 2013, it is estimated that it's going to have 7.5% growth rate. 7.5% it's an incredible growth, but it is not the same thing as 12. So in a country as Brazil, which economy is totally linked to the Chinese economy, what happened is that during 2011, Brazil grew about 7%, and by 2012, it reduced to 0.7%. So that could be maybe one of the signs to understand why we have these social riots in Brazil that were not expected. However, we believe that it has to do with the impact of the global crisis, which became a regional crisis because the Brazilian exports to China were reduced, and at the same time, the Chinese exports to Europe were also reduced as a result of the deacceleration process in Europe and the implementation of austerity policies. So the Eurozone now has a zero growth rate. So in order to understand the future of Latin America from the social point of view, we cannot avoid the rule that is being mapped out by world development. We are part of an interdependence phenomenon. What can happen in Latin America from the point of view of growth and reduction of gaps in social inequality depends upon what's going to happen in the global framework to begin with. I think we still have some minutes because I would like to talk about something else that will take us into current times. How are we going to approach the global crisis? I think we are witnesses of this crisis of world leadership that has been shown in the G20. G20 has not been able to establish a line for everybody to face global crisis. On one side, we have the idea that what's priority, that the priority and the emergency is to face the debt, this sovereignty debt, which was created as a result of the establishment of policies to save the banks that were bankrupt. And now we want to have this as a priority in order to come ahead of the global crisis. We also have the U.S. model that has been established by President Obama, which at the beginning has been hindered by the opposition of Congress, trying to use tax measures to resolve the problem of job creation, and the Mexican government's done it by using the Federal Reserve. Usually we have bonds of equivalent to 85 billion US, with which the economy can grow a little bit, very fragile, but a little bit. For 2013, based upon the forecast of the International Monetary Fund, they're going to have a growth of 1.6%, but that is larger than what Europe has. And it has to do with the policies that are flexible, but which at the same time the austerity that is creating a lot of social problems. But the austerity policies is what's going on in Europe. In Europe, for example, their political situation is characterized by the social protest, by the situation of those that are non-satisfied of what Angela Merkel said, that everyone that's been in power in Europe, either conservative or social democrat or whatever, has lost. So we just have political anarchy, as is happening in Italy, where all governments are always under a high risk position with high volatility, just because currently there is a crisis of chronic political legitimacy in Italy.
Well, in a situation as the one we're just describing, in which world leadership has no idea of how to leave this world crisis in the short term, this is going to have an immediate effect in the Latin American economies. We cannot see immediately the same growth rates that we saw in the last decade. Therefore, those achievements that we have in reducing poverty and social inequality at this moment, we have to take a close look at them, because they are not going to be receiving the same economic power that they used to have. Therefore, I have to say that what is right now being contemplated at the global economy level is not other thing but the final stage of financing stage of the global economy. Although we have a strong reticence to change is being introduced through regulatory mechanisms to the financial system, and there are several mechanisms to do so. In the U.S., they have passed the Dodd-Frank Act, applied only in the U.S., and this regulation is being undertaken in some of the agencies that have to do with future commodities contracts. There are some guidelines in Europe for regulating the bank system, and we're doing this to reach a global system of financial regulation. And I think that then we're going to make a transition towards what should be a new economical model, leaving behind the financing of the global economy or the neoliberal model in its different versions. I think it's very difficult to make a forecast of how the economic growth and development and social cohesion is going to be in 2020, because we would be talking about just 7 years, and in the short term our horizon still looks great. in the medium and long term, we can forecast a turnover on this growth and a turnover on this sustained development based on the fact that below the surface in the current global crisis, there is a process of revolution in the productive processes of the world. This scientific and technological revolution is going to make way to a great growth with the manufacturing of new goods and services that are going to make deep changes in the world economy. We are talking about what has to do with energy. Recent discovery of the schisto gas in the US and in Canada and in other Latin American countries will generate a reduction of this kind of renewable sources will generate great investments in hydraulic energy, solar energy, thermic energy, which will have a great impact. The same will happen with the transportation system and in climate change combat and in the health sector with new technologies to fight diseases and in the education sector as well. I think that at this moment the world is at a breaking point where the old is fighting to live and the new thing is not being born yet. We're at this point of inflection and we need to let the old things die and we need to let new things be born. We know that in the medium and long term, in the scenarios that we have for our future, we can foresee optimistically and having hope in our future that Latin America is going to go down a path of economic growth and sustainable growth and development with the creation of social policies in favor of our citizens. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, President. We have 2 shifts of Q&A due to the time that we have left. If you agree, we can do a group of questions and we try to have very brief questions so we can brief answers so we can answer to all of these questions. One of the topics that you were touching is that Latin America is living a stability period in democracy that is the longest in history, you know. But you were also saying that this democracy is coexisting with some patterns and informal institutions and political culture modalities and behaviors that are sometimes anti-establishment that are attempting against this democracy. So maybe at a national level we have routinely democracies with the exercise of rights that are even broader and maybe in a 3rd generation, but we are also finding in some places in Latin America some pockets, great pockets that they have some authoritarianism, customerism. This development makes democracy by itself to be slowed down. Not every citizen has the same right in all of the territory in all of the countries in Latin America. It is not the same to be poor or rich. It's not the same to be in a conditioned transference model. It's not the same to be an indigenous people or living in a city or living in any other community that is not a city in Latin America. This is a tension. How can we solve this tension when there is an economic flow and growth and development and money is flowing and in some way we can generate alternatives? But your vision, I think, is somehow pessimistic in this way, because it seems like we are going back in the cycle that from what was being said yesterday and in this last generation, so from what you just said, it seems like this scenario is not very optimistic for a future, at least in the terms of the 2020 that we are taking a look at right now. What is your answer here? Everything that you say, Flavia, is totally right. We must understand that there are some very new democracies, fragile democracies in Latin America. In spite of the great achievements that we've had in institutional terms, I think that in the contemporary construction of Latin American democracy, we have gone through several stages. One of the first one is this electoral democracy. First stage is giving respect to human rights, to constitutionality, building a state of right. Now we're going to a social and economic topic. That's the second stage. In this stage, we have the challenges of inequality and exclusion. You are mentioning the case of indigenous communities, the case of women, of African American, Afro-descendant citizens, and the several sectors of the society. I believe that right now we are more aware of these exclusion conditions than we had before. We have that in our agenda now. Thus, we are designing policies that are oriented to these particular sectors. The gender topic, we have political parties and governments who are allocating representative proportions and the same on gender quotas, and this is happening also with indigenous communities which have new policies that are designed and oriented to incorporate them at the different levels of society. Now, I don't want to make an impression that the social and economic future of Latin America, the combat against poverty, is exclusively dependent of what is going to happen in this time. We have to comply with our own homeworks, and this homework is also in adjusting and designing a new social and economic development model that is in harmony with the consolidation of a democratic and social state of right. I would like to say, to get rid of this pessimistic idea that I may have given, this fact and the region in general, we have to go through what's been called convenient transformation. This model is still current nowadays. Of course, it would have to be adjusted to the idea that we have to combine two models, one that is currently in force of intense work. Why do we have to go on with an intensive model? Because it's the one that generates jobs. Our problem is in informal job sector, and us through creating intensive work that could be promoted by creating small and medium companies through credits and tax incentives. That is going to generate formal jobs. In this intensive work model may work. No country is going to transform in these times just based on SMEs. We have to combine this with an intensive capital, with a strong technological basis. This will allow us to have goods and services with a greater added value. This will generate a greater wealth, and we will increase the yearly GDP. This will give place to increase in the per capita GDP. So the economical and social future of our region is linked to our own capacity in a global interdependence framework to generate more productivity, have more competitiveness, and greater innovation. This innovation has to be done with sophisticated products. It could even happen with handcrafted products, but our ability to be part of this global value chain in this power community is going to help. President, one of the questions that arose yesterday was the tension on the lack of capacity of the state to meet the requirements and demands of the citizens, or the difficulties of the state. And we were talking about the weaknesses of our state. We were talking about insecurity, inequality. Even though we have a decrease in inequality, it's still growing. Another topic is corruption. That means that we are lacking the correct control mechanisms, and in the event of corruption cases, that justice is independent and acts consequently. This has generated that citizens are unhappy. You said that transitions generated great expectations, and the truth is that transitions were so limited. We were afraid of what would happen because there were several actors with some vetoes, and we were limiting our capacities. We know that while we've had 35 years of democracy in some of the countries, democracy for our citizens, whether because they have great expectations of what they want from this democracy or because the state is not meeting their needs, we are generating a disenchantment of democracy, feelings of discontent towards democracy. After saying this, what should be the role of the social society that have so much echo in the social networks and even broadening these social movements regarding democracy? I mean, is this a response? Are these movements a kind of response, such as the Indignados movement in Spain or the Yo Soy 132 in Mexico, or recent protests of the middle class in Brazil? How can we read this in a democratic point of view? I would say that this has to do with the new challenges that democracy has to live. At the first moment, we were talking about the legitimacy, then it becomes in social and economic demands. At the same time, it has to do with the institutional strengthening and participation of the citizens. This is of how the state has to provide greater security to the citizens before drug smuggling, weapon smuggling. All these kind of problems are combined into a matter of transparency and accountability, of responsibility and access to information. I believe that to a lesser or greater degree, in the several countries we're moving forward on this regard. We have made advances in constitutional reforms that are limiting the exercising of the power. If we used to talk about some chronicle presidentialism, the constitutional reforms of today are now limiting this power that are backed by the states themselves. In Latin America, we haven't seen as a rule this referendum. However, there are some constitutions that see this as a possibility. In Latin America, we didn't see before the popular initiative for the legislation, and we are now seeing it in the Constitution to protect the rights of our citizens. There has been some advance that has been remarkable in Latin America towards having access to the information, thanks to the access to public information laws that we have. That is a way of guaranteeing transparency. Some laws have been passed regarding public bidding that didn't exist before. So I understand that this has represented an advance, although it's still not enough, because we're always starting from the premise that democracy is experiment that is always inconclusive, but we're still advancing. So these protests and movements that you've made reference to are very interesting in the fact that they are global. These protests began in Europe, are happening now in Asia, recently in Indonesia and Thailand. Protests in the most unexpected places in Latin America. Protests aren't happening in Haiti, they're happening in Brazil, and they follow a different nature to those usual social protests that used to happen in Latin America and the rest of the world. That is what's happening now. It's a revolution of the middle class that feels affected by the erosion of their quality of life, produced by the continuity of the global economic crisis. This recession has spanned for nearly 7 to 8 years. It doesn't seem to have an end anytime soon. Governments are applying some restrictive policies, from what we call of market techniques. Instead of coup d'etats, we're doing coup de markets. We are using social networks to create mobilizations, especially on the aspects of social and economic demands. It's true that as a result of the modernization process that we are going through, in which demands are greater as time goes by, we are having growing expectations. The greater achievements we have, the greater the demands they are becoming. But there's an overburden of demands, and there's an inability of the states to tend to these needs. For example, the supervision problem. When we compare the tax income from Latin America against the ones in Europe, we can see that there's an impressive difference. Such as a country in Mexico and Dominican Republic, we have an tax income of 13% against the GDP. Mexico has an advantage that they have an income from oil that is calculated separately from the tax income. But when you have a 13% of tax income and you say that 4% of this in education, you are ruling a country that has 4% of taxability. You have a state that is poor and that is trying to meet the needs, the social needs of a social structure that's been evolving from a poor society into a middle-class society. So these are the needs that are happening in Latin America. The problem of tax pressure, I think it's a topic that should be touched so we can generate efficient governments that can make some public expenditure that is in coordination to the strategic goals of achieving a sustainable growth. Mr. President, our time for this session has now concluded. Regrettably, there are many questions to be answered. I would have loved to make a summary of them. I think it would be great if you took this question so you can give some direct responses. There are emails here, and I believe that there are some issues that are worth to be answered. Thank you very much. And with this, we conclude this keynote speech of President Leonel Fernández. Thank you very much.
Buenos días. Tendremos un pequeño break de 10 minutos.
Good morning. We will have a 10-minute break and we'll start once
Muchas
again.
gracias.
Thank you very much.